think about where you're heading, not where you're at, because as the saying goes, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. Welcome to Quirky French Podcast, the podcast that helps you speak more confidently, feel more focused, and be more in control of your French learning journey. Prêt? C'est parti! Welcome to episode 11 of Quirky French Podcast, the podcast that helps you develop learning strategies and confidence in French, even if you're confused, overwhelmed, and basically have no idea how to reach your goal. I'm your host, Naima from quirkyfrench.com, and today I wanted to chat about the dreaded learning plateau, the intermediate plateau, that stage where you're not a beginner anymore, you reach the intermediate level, and yet it feels like despite all your hard work, you're not making much progress. You know, that feeling when you study really hard, you invest time, effort, money, and yet, you turn on the TV, you start to watch a movie on Netflix, and you're like, I have no idea what this character is talking about. I have no idea what the plot is about. Or perhaps you listen to a podcast and you get completely lost after a few seconds as well. You can hear words, but you still can't figure out what they're talking about, what they're saying. After that much studying, you'd expect that you'd be able to follow along. You'd expect to feel a bit more comfortable listening to some French or even speaking, engaging in conversations. You'd expect to have a level of fluency that at least allows you to chat pretty comfortably and have a pretty solid conversational base, but you're still struggling a lot. You try tons of techniques to improve, and yet you still don't feel like your French is progressing that much. It's like one step forward, two steps back. It just feels like you're stagnating and your French is never going to take off. That feeling. Well, today I'm going to help you make the most of that stage, and I'm going to help you find your way to progress despite that experience and those negative emotions. Okay? Allez, on y va. So, let's start by talking about the intermediate plateau. The learning plateau, the intermediate plateau, is a critical stage in your French learning journey. And all learners go through that stage. I personally went through it myself, and I can honestly say it's hard. Learning languages is hard. It's tough. It's a really slow process. So when you get to that land where you don't really have a sense of satisfaction anymore, where you don't feel like you've learned anything, you've just put in the work, you sat down for an hour, and at the end of this hour, you don't have that sense of achievement. You feel like you're still struggling, you don't really know how to improve anymore. When you get to that point, learning can become a bit of a chore. And it's a critical stage precisely because this is the stage where most learners are going to quit. But if you're listening to this episode, I'm fairly sure you don't intend to quit, but sometimes quitting actually starts with what happens in your mind before you even know it. You get frustrated, and so you end up being not as consistent anymore in your routine. And so you end up losing momentum. You lose sight of your ultimate goal, you get a bit distracted, or you start doubting yourself and your abilities because you don't see any progress. And there's a lot of things that can happen mentally, so you really want to be mindful of that when you're in the plateau stage, because over time you could lose your motivation and you could end up giving up altogether before you even realize what's happened. Okay, so let's start by talking about the plateau itself and what it is. It's important to understand how language learning works because that's going to help you recognize what you're going through, and you're going to be able to navigate the plateau stage with less frustration and ultimately overcome it. So the first thing to understand is that learning is not a linear process. You've probably heard the phrase learning curve before. So learning curve refers to that progress that learners make over time in any learning journey, not just languages. So that process, that progress is not a straight linear line. It's more like a curve. So if you think about the first times, just remember the first time, the first few weeks when you learned French. Every time you studied, you could feel that you had acquired new knowledge or a new skill. Things felt fun and rewarding because you were learning something new each time. All of a sudden, there's that whole new world that opens up to you. You start to recognize some words, you can say a few things, and as a learner, you're kind of on a roll because you can really feel the progress. This is the beginner stage where you learn a lot each time you practice, and it feels great, it feels amazing. And over time, as you're gaining more and more experience, your progress slows down. You put the same amount of work and time, but at the end of, let's say, 1 hour of study practice, for example, you've barely learned a thing. Introducing the intermediate plateau. And at this stage, you could start to feel like you're kind of stagnating. But this is actually completely normal, and it has nothing to do with you. It doesn't mean you're bad at French. It doesn't mean that something went wrong along that learning journey. This is a stage that everyone hits at some point. And here's what happens in more detail. So when you learn French for the first time, you basically learn the basics, the foundation of the language. For example, you learn essential and frequent words, so you'll be using them all the time. And you can even think about your mother tongue in English. When you were a child, you learned a lot of new words, but as an adult, you've more or less already learned the most important and frequent English words. So you may learn rare words or specific jargon occasionally, but the truth is, those words are not very frequent. And so in spite of the many years that you've spoken English, the rate at which you learn new words obviously slows down, and it's a natural process. And so when it comes to acquiring new language in French, it's basically the same. For example, when you were a beginner, you could open a French book and every word would be new. Everything would feel new. There would be something new to learn each time. Whereas as an intermediate learner, now you can open a book and notice that only a few words will be new because you already know the basics. So really, it just boils down to simple maths. The opportunities to come across and learn something new now become scarce, hence the slower rate of learning. Okay, so it's really important to understand that because it helps putting an end to that spiral where you start to feel guilty or you start to think that there's something wrong. It's just basic maths, okay? Literally, you've already learned the foundation. So now to get to that next stage, something else needs to happen, and the way you're going to be approaching your learning needs to be a bit different. Okay, so how do we overcome the intermediate plateau then? Well, the first thing is to understand that this is a completely normal process, and because learning is meant to be slower now, there isn't actually anything to overcome. You're not bad at French, you're not stuck, and nothing is going wrong, okay? So simply keep going. You are already doing the right thing. You're already on the right track. However, here are some quirky tips I'm going to share with you to help you keep going and regain confidence in your learning. Right, so first of all, your mindset is super important. Think of the intermediate plateau as a stage where everything you do counts, even if you don't see the results just yet. Imagine you're planting a seed. Every day you water the soil, but you don't see anything. You water it day after day, still nothing. You know that you're supposed to water it, you know that it matters, you know it's important, but you don't see the results until one morning you find a little seedling. And it's exactly the same thing with where you're at right now in your learning. So here are some things that you can do to help along the way. First, again, I'm stating the obvious here, but stick to it. Keep at it, keep working consistently, keep your routine going. Yes, the rate of progress is slower, but it's still there. It's still happening. You just don't happen to see it. So right now is the moment where you need to be even more diligent in your learning and be disciplined. Next, find a way to enjoy the learning process. You don't have to just learn the language in its purest way, just by doing vocab and grammar and so on. Perhaps now you can do some fun things like playing games in French, listening to music, basically finding a different entryway to learning that you enjoy. And by simply exploring all those other things surrounding the language, your French will develop over time and in a much more, relaxed, comfortable and enjoyable manner. And finally, don't focus on your immediate results and immediate progress. Instead, keep your ultimate goal in mind. Think about where you're heading, not where you're at, because as the saying goes, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. Okay? So, it's difficult to accept that it takes time. It is a slow process. And for that reason, it is a true challenge. Whenever you're experiencing that frustration, that disappointment, that feeling that you're not going anywhere, remind yourself of the fact that it is challenging and it does take time. But what's difficult is not the French that you're learning. You're not stuck. You're not learning anything that's harder than the previous lessons that you've done in the past. What's challenging is what happens in your mind. And you really want to remind yourself that you're simply not making visible, instant progress. This is going to help you look at this stage in a more positive light. If you're plateauing right now and if you're feeling all those emotions, it basically means that you're not a beginner anymore. And that's a good thing. You want to be in that stage. You want to go through that stage, because it is the promise of a breakthrough ahead of you. So trust that you're doing something right, even if you don't know what it is. Embrace the plateau. Find comfort in knowing that it will pay off. Don't look for instant results. Just trust in the process by simply sticking to it. Something is going to click and you'll see in the end, the seed will turn to a beautiful plant one day. Okay? So that's it. The intermediate plateau stage, learn to embrace it and learn to accept it. And there's actually nothing to overcome. In future episodes, we're going to dive deeper and I'll share with you a specific method and a specific approach that will help you address the most frequent weak areas and the most common issues that occur in the intermediate plateau. So keep your eyes open for new content. If you liked this episode and if you found it helpful, it would mean so much if you could share it with another learner or rate it a 5-star on Spotify. Ratings are very important because it really helps the podcast reach more learners and it also helps me create even better content for the future. So if you have a second, that would mean a lot if you considered doing it. So we're getting to the end of today's episode, but I will catch up with you next week for another episode of Quirky French Podcast. Have an amazing weekend, a beautiful week, and as always, keep learning, keep growing, and keep it quirky. Bon week-end et à plus tard.